Hi, thank you for tuning into the Short Stacks. I'm Lisa Quintero, Young Adult Librarian.
And I'm Lizzie Jelly, Virtual Engagement Librarian.
This is the show where we talk to you about what we've been reading, listening to, or watching. And this month, we're talking to you about nonfiction books that we've been reading.
Yes, I am so excited because this podcast actually forced me to read some nonfiction and break me out of my fantasy romance. I'm not going to call it a reading rut because I thoroughly enjoyed being there, but it's nice to mix it up. And this was a really good push in that direction.
Yeah. Sometimes we got to step out of our comfort zone. And one of my books talks about that a little bit. So
yeah, let's talk about being pushed out of our comfort zone.
All right, let's talk about it. So the first book that I read was called The Comfort Crisis, Embrace Discomfort to Reclaim Your Wild, Happy, Healthy Self, written by Michael Easter. Came out in 2021. It is read by the author because I did all my books as audiobooks, just full disclosure. And they were all either on Hoopla or Libby. So it's read by the author. He is a contributing editor of Men's Health magazine, and he is also a regular columnist for Outside magazine. And so he's won a lot of awards with his journalism. And in this book, he talks to researchers and adventurers to discover the secret of why discomfort is important and necessary in order to test our physical and mental endurance. And so along the way, he learns that by pushing ourselves out of our comfort zone, because we live in this world now where like everything for most people is very easily accessible, through technology. A lot of us work jobs where we sit most of the day. A lot of us can order things and have them come straight to our house. And we don't have to do the things that our ancestors did in terms of foraging for food or going on adventures or, having to hike across the plains to get somewhere. We don't do that stuff anymore. And so it talks about pushing yourself every once in a while, physically, mentally, in order to reinforce certain neural pathways. And they found that by doing so, you end up releasing your depression levels and your anxiety levels, and you also decrease burnout. And so he talks to a few different people. He talks to a person who's one of the exercise scientists for the NBA, and they talk about how, if their lead athletes are performing the same exercises all the time, their muscles get used to the things that they're doing, and they don't ever get stronger or better at what they're doing. Yeah. So they have to create these training programs where they're getting different input and pushing them to their limits in different ways. But, they do it in a way that's safe because they don't want to completely hurt the players, but at the same time, they push them. And so a lot of the book talks about, pushing yourself not to the I'm gonna die limit, the goal is to that's one thing that he talks about. And he talks about in Japanese culture how one of the things is that people in Japan tend to accept death more. And he's in the West we don't really like to talk about death and we don't accept death. And he's we need to learn to accept death, but we also don't want to push ourselves to that level, but you want to push yourself close to that, but not quite there,
Okay.
So
learn your limits.
Yeah. So he ends up going on this long hunting trip for 3 months up in Alaska with a couple guys who do that regularly. And they live out in the wilderness for 3 months and have to evade bears and live off of just tiny little rations of food. And he doesn't know if he's going to be able to do it. And he ends up doing it. And they end up, they get an elk and they kill it and they eat it and they do the whole thing. And that's the way that he chooses to test himself. But he also talks to other people who choose to test themselves in different ways, people who are backpackers and people who, are athletes and people who do spiritual practices, and how all of these different things, all of them, the thing that they have in common is pushing people outside of their comfort zone. And in that, you kind of reset your brain. He also talks about cold therapy, which is something that I've heard more about in recent years, which is the thing where instead of taking hot showers, you take cold showers because it resets your nervous system.
Okay.
And
I've heard that when you're feeling anxious, you're supposed to put your face in a bowl of ice water to reset your anxiety. And I've never done it, but I've had friends do it and they say it's really helpful.
Yeah, same. I'm not a Polar Bear Club member, the people who go swimming in Lake Michigan. Yeah. I don't do that.
I'm not going to push myself that far.
But I do know people who do that, and they say that it works really well for them. And I'm okay, I'm not very good with the cold, but I can push myself in other ways. And I like this book a lot because I found that with COVID and all the stuff that was happening in the last couple of years, I started pushing myself to do some things. I'd never gone camping before, and I talked about this on the last season or 2 seasons ago on the podcast. And I pushed myself to do this thing that I'd never done before. And when I go and do it now, I've pushed myself to do longer trips or things like that, because it's like self-esteem building to be like, hey, look, I can actually do this thing. I can survive out in the wilderness for like a week by myself and be perfectly okay. And, nothing's going to kill me or like, yes, you got to be smart about things. You shouldn't just go out there without like any plan or anything like
Please
that.
Please research first.
Because the idea is not to die. The idea is to push yourself out of your comfort level. And he also talks about that too. It's like some people are like extremists. And so it's like some people are going to push themselves closer to that brink. And other people, it's just a matter of getting out of your office chair, out of your office and going out there and doing something different, trying a new hobby, trying something different just to get, different neural pathways going in your brain and to increase dopamine and get you less stressed out and less depressed. So yeah, that was good.
Super cool. Speaking of death, we all know, well, maybe you guys listening don't know this yet, but many people in my life know that I have like a weird fascination with like death culture and like funeral practices. And so I love reading books about this. One of my favorite books is a book called Dark Archives, and it's about books found in human skin.
Okay.
I'm not talking about that one today, but it's really good if you're into that sort of thing. But I want to mention a book called All the Living and the Dead, From Embalmers to Executioners, an exploration of the people who have made death their life's work, by Hayley Campbell. And it's all about people who work in the death industry. Mm-hmm. And so it's really interesting. I haven't finished it yet, but I started it last night, and I went way further than I intended to because I got hooked so fast. So Campbell is a journalist by trade, and that really kind of comes through in how she approaches writing this book, because each chapter is focused on interviewing one person who works at a different part of the death industry. Mm-hmm. So the first chapter, she interviews and works with a funeral director in the UK. And some other chapters, she works with like a crime scene cleaner and what did she call it? A bereavement midwife. Okay. So just like all kinds of stuff across the board about like cultural and kind of more technical aspects of death. Mm-hmm. And in the opening, she talks about something that you mentioned, that how, especially here in Western culture, we're really hesitant to talk about death. It's kind of a taboo for us. We don't like to engage with it until we're forced to. Mm-hmm. And one thing that I thought really interesting that came in early on in the book is the first chapter follows a funeral director in the UK, and she's giving a talk at a college where they're having like a wake for someone who died like 270 years ago because they're in like an embalming program. And she says that the first dead body you see shouldn't be someone that you know. Mm-hmm. And I was like, interesting. And she goes into like a whole bunch of reasons about why that is, of how it's good to like confront death without confronting that kind of grief at the same time, and to like do that kind of in stages. And so the author, Hayley Campbell, goes with her to her mortuary. Mm-hmm. And she does like, what's it called? Kind of like natural burial and stuff. Like she doesn't embalm. She talks a little bit about why that's not something that she does at her practice, and about how that kind of end of life care is really personal to the person whose life is ended, and about how like she can do that if that's something they want, but she kind of advocates for doing it kind of naturally. And what Hayley Campbell does when she's there is she helps prepare a body for cremation. And so she like works with the people who work at the funeral home to like kind of, get the body ready, and they talk about like what it's like and about how important it is and about all the different steps that come in with it. And it's fascinating. Yeah. If you're into this sort of stuff, it's so cool. And it's like really cool to watch her insert herself in it, that kind of journalistic energy where she's like, she talks about her experience. She's like, this is me doing the thing and confronting death with someone I've never met. Yeah. She refers to him like by Adam. She actually has a really funny foreword at the beginning of the book where she's like, all the living people, I'm using their real names, but I'm using fake names to protect the identities of the dead. And I thought that was hilarious. And that humor kind of comes through as she writes all these chapters too. Like it's got some kind of raunchy humor in it, some kind of body humor. And it reminds me a little bit of Mary Roach. Okay. If you're into her, like she wrote a book called Stiff that's also about the death industry. Fuzz is her recent one. And there's a lot of kind of, for lack of a better term, gallows humor in it. Yeah. Like there can't not be. And it's so fascinating. And she really spends some time at the end of the chapter. Like she walks us through her experience, like prepping the body, what it was like, and like kind of what it looked like and what they do and kind of how they make those decisions. And she walks us through her process. She's like, wow, this is what it felt like to confront death with a man I've never met. But I'm only just a couple chapters in, but I'm a big fan. And I highly recommend it if you are looking for a way to kind of investigate the death industry without, going and physically confronting a body, yes. I guess, if you want to kind of do it through a book. This is awesome. And like it's really beautifully written, and it's written with a lot of care as well. Like it's not crass, it's not over the top. but it's definitely not for the squeamish because she doesn't shy away from the realities of death, the industry. Like she's interviewing a crime scene cleaner in one of them. So there's some gruesome stuff in here, but it's so cool and it's so fascinating. And it's not out of my comfort zone personally, but for some of our listeners, this book may be well out of your comfort zone. Yeah. So if you're looking to push yourself, I highly recommend.
No, that sounds interesting.
And it's got a really pretty cover too. Like it's got like a skull and a bird and some plants and all these things kind of pop up in the book as well and all the little stories. But don't judge a book by its cover, but I regularly do. And it was so pretty on the shelf. I was like, I gotta read that.
Yeah, it is pretty. Yeah, little known fact, I wanted to be a mortician when I was in high school.
I also wanted to be a mortician. Maybe, I don't know, there's something about librarians, morticians. There's some overlap. I firmly believe that. But I truly think in a different timeline, that's where I would be.
Yeah, same. But yeah, anyway, I'm going to move on to the Anthropocene Reviewed, which is a book that was written by John Green. And for those who don't know, John Green has kind of been a big deal in at least the young adult community, but in general in the literary community for a while. His first book came out in 2005. It was Looking for Alaska. He used to be a reviewer, editor at American Library Association's Booklist magazine. And while he was doing that, he also wrote a lot of essays for NPR's All Things Considered and for Chicago's public radio station WBEZ. And after that, once he started writing books and stopped working at Booklist, because he had a little bit of a breakdown, he ended up starting this thing called Vlogbrothers with his brother on YouTube. They were some of the early YouTube people, and they also got some money from Google at one point to start something called Crash Course, where they taught all these different classes on like history and science and things like that. And so he, in 2021, came out with this book called The Anthropocene Reviewed, and it was born from a podcast of the same name. And in it, he reviews various facets of our current geological age, which is the Anthropocene, on a 5-star scale.
Oh, that's kind of fun.
Yeah. And it goes all over the place, you know, like his favorite beverage is Diet Dr. Pepper. So he like reads like, because the audiobook is great because it's read by him. And it's like you're listening to a podcast because
he's got a good voice.
He's got a great narrating voice. Yeah. And so he goes into this whole thing about why he loves Diet Dr. Pepper and the history of Dr. Pepper, which I had no idea. Apparently, Dr. Pepper was made from combining all of the soda flavors together. It was some person's idea. Because I learned that soda, like, it used to be that, you know, we drink pop soda, whatever. I call it pop. I'm from Chicago. Yeah. But we drink that stuff as just, like, a beverage now, but it used to be combined with medicines in order to make them more palatable. And so he talks about that a little bit and how this pharmacist ended up combining a bunch of them together and how it got the name Dr. Pepper. And so there's an essay on that. There's also an essay on the history of the QWERTY keyboard, which was born here in Milwaukee, Wisconsin.
Oh, that's cool. I didn't know that.
Yeah. He also talks about his community experience and the deep loneliness of COVID-19 because he lives in Indianapolis, Indiana now. And so for years, ever since he moved to Indianapolis from Chicago, he said that, you know, when he first moved there, he was like, this is stupid. But he's like, everybody goes to the Indy 500. And he's like, it's so loud. He's somebody who suffers with like anxiety and obsessive compulsive disorder. And he was like, I can't do this. But then some of his friends like started this thing where they would like, everybody gets on their bikes and they meet up in this one place in Indianapolis and they all bike out together to the place where the Indy 500 is held.
Oh, like the racetrack.
Yeah, the racetrack. And they have like a picnic and they just kind of, you know, embrace the chaos because it's like you can't fight it. You're going to hear the cars anyway. You might as well just embrace the chaos and have fun. And so he talks about that and he talks about doing that you know, after COVID and how it was so weird because there were no spectators after COVID, whereas before that you could hear the spectators from like miles away. There was cars everywhere, you know, and it's like, and now you can like, well, I don't know about now, but like when he was writing this essay, like it was closed off to spectators. So you just saw these cars like in their pit crews, like on the track, but everything else was empty and they didn't have as many people in their normal group of cyclists, you know, cycling out to the track, and it just didn't have the same energy. And he's really good about writing about sadness in like a poignant way. And you can tell he's a very introspective person, and that's one thing that a lot of people love about his books, you know, like The Fault in Our Stars and Looking for Alaska and all that. And a lot of them have gotten turned into movies. So But yeah. And then, he also talks about like the cave paintings of Lascaux, and he talks about the Canada geese.
I do love geese.
Yeah, he's just all over the place. And some of the essays are, a little bit sad and bittersweet, and some of the essays are super funny, and some of the essays are just really informative, and you're like, you learn some things. And I just really enjoy listening to him speak. So I highly recommend that one, especially as an audiobook.
Cool. I feel like I got to pick that one up, though. I don't know. We all know that I sometimes struggle with nonfiction because I'm slower at reading it. It takes me a while to get into it. But I've recently found a love of kind of essay collections where I can kind of pick and choose, or like, I don't know, I call them kind of choose your own adventure nonfiction. Yeah. Like you can go as deep as you want to, but if you skip parts, it's okay. And that kind of fits in with the next book I want to talk about, which is called The Darkness Manifesto on Light Pollution, Night Ecology, and the Ancient Rhythms That Sustain Life by Johan Eklof. He is a Swedish conservationist and bat scientist. His words, not mine. I was like, I want to be a bat scientist. That's so cool. But the English translation of his book just came out like a couple weeks ago. And it's actually quite popular. There's a few holes on it, so I got to get this back in the bin after the podcast so someone else can get their hands on it. But it's a really fast-paced book, and it's just plumb full of facts, stats, anecdotes, and the chapters are really short, which is not something, maybe it's just the nonfiction that I've picked up. But, you pick it up, and like each chapter is like 20 to 30 pages, and I feel like I get bogged down by it so fast. But the chapters in this are like 5 to 12 pages max. Most of them are around 7 pages. Okay. And so we really whip through it. But he's focusing on the way that light and artificial light specifically, like the light bulb invented roughly 150 years ago, has really had a huge impact on the world, our ecosystem, and our lives and bodies. And so it's like, it's just so fascinating. I learned so much from this little book. And each chapter goes into like a hyper-specific aspect of like what this light is doing, how darkness is important to very specific creatures. Like he has a whole chapter on like those little, I don't remember the name of them, but those little glowing creatures in the ocean that when you touch them, they light up at night.
Oh, yeah, I know what you're talking about.
I don't remember the name of them. It's like cyano something.
Yeah.
And then he like gives us a little story about him diving in and like watching his glowing trail, and about how, humans can see this from about 40 feet away, but the giant squid can see this from like miles. And it's really cool. And it's like really good if you're kind of like me and you don't want to necessarily deep dive into every single chapter, but you can kind of pick and choose. Some chapters that he writes are more focused on like stories about darkness. Like he'll give a story about how the changes in light have impacted like a lake where his grandfather had a cabin, where he grew up in Sweden, and the eel population has really decreased because darkness is really important to them for like breeding and mating and all that kind of stuff. And how now there's hardly any eels in there. But he's like, but when my grandfather first built this cabin, he was eating eels all the time. He said I couldn't get enough of the eels. But it's so cool. And it's so, I don't know, he brings it all together because he talks about how artificial light has had a real domino effect on the ecosystem and our lives. And it's like, it starts with bugs where they get confused. They've got their reproduction impacted. Like suddenly they like confuse light for the moon. And so they get like stuck in these loops and they get exhausted, scared, and they don't feed, they don't mate, and so they start to die off. And then when the bugs start to die off, of course, the bats start going hungry because they're also getting confused. There's just less of them to eat. The birds get confused. They get scared. I don't know. And it all comes down to us because it's disrupting our circadian rhythms as well. Because all this artificial light, it disrupts our sleep, it impacts our hormones, and it increases our stress. It's just, there's so much in here. There's really so much. But he talks at the end of the book, it's not all doom and gloom. And he writes it in a way it's really fun all the way through, even as he's talking about how there's this really interesting chapter on the 9/11 memorial and how once a year they light it up with those really big lights. And he talks about how because they only do that one day a year, scientists come from all over to study the impact of those mega bright lights, right? And about how the birds get really disrupted and it disrupts all the animals. And he's like, yeah, we do this as kind of like an art piece, a memorial, but this is the impact that has for us to look at some cool lights for a while. These birds are terrified.
Yeah.
And it's so cool. I'm really fired up about it actually. And I'm like, I gotta go change all the light bulbs in my house. But he does. At the end of the book, he talks about some suggestions for how we can kind of embrace the darkness, he calls it, and reduce this excess light that we're producing. And also I'll share a couple of them with you in case you don't want to read through the whole book to get there. Some of them they talks about are using downward aimed lights. He also talks about changing the color of the lights that we're using, because those like bright white LEDs are the closest to like midday sunlight. And so shifting for some of those warmer colors that are more close to like dusk hour is really helpful for the environment. Using timers on our lights so they're only on when we need them, or using motion sensing lights so they're only on when we actually need to have that light on. And just learning to be more comfortable with the dark. He talks about that a lot too, is like we have this kind of, humans are very kind of freaked out by the dark. And some of that is like biological, evolutionary. But he's like, we can see more than we think we can. We just don't give our eyes a chance to actually develop that night vision, because all it takes is like one glance of headlights and suddenly that's gone. And he talks about for people who live in like cities, we may have, if you've never left the city, you may have never actually experienced true night vision because there's constant amounts of light pollution. And so I thought that was really fascinating, because it brought me back to like, you know, I grew up in a very rural community, and like so rural that I always talk about it as like true darkness, right? Like my parents and I would go outside to like look at the stars. We'd turn off all the lights in the house. We'd turn off the yard light, and we'd sit out there for like 45 minutes so our eyes could adjust. And you can actually see so much, but you can see the glow from like all the little towns. And like, I'm not going to call them cities. They were like, you know, 500 people. We call them cities. But the way we can like see that light from, you know, 40 miles away and how that has such a huge impact. But he even talked about how like on the days or the nights when the moon is too bright, even that's enough to disrupt the night routines of some animals, because it makes them vulnerable, that light. So it's awesome. But he does have, the very last chapter is the Darkness Manifesto itself, where he outlines like kind of like 10 tenets of how we can learn to work with darkness, embrace darkness, become aware of it, and work to kind of foster darkness in our lives instead of being scared of it, to really kind of embrace it as like part of our natural world and lives, and to really kind of protect the world that we have. But it's super fascinating. And also at each chapter, there's like a little kind of image at the beginning, and there's lots of little bats hidden throughout, because he's a bat scientist. So it was really cool, and it was a fairly quick read as well. If you're looking for some, I don't know, some hyper-specific nonfiction about light and darkness.
Well, that pairs well with the book that I'm going to talk about. I read An Immense World, How Animal Senses Reveal the Hidden Realms Around Us by Ed Young. And he is a Pulitzer Prize-winning science journalist. And it is very similar because it covers the light aspect of things, but it also covers things like sound, touch. It covers what he calls the animal's Umwelt. And Umwelt is a German word, and it is translated to environment. And so he talks about how each animal, each creature, insect, including human animals, how we all have our own Umwelt, because we all have our own experience of the world. So, you know, humans, we rely on sight, touch, and taste and hearing a lot, but other animals might rely more on one sense than another. So dogs tend to rely a lot more on their sense of smell. And he talks a lot about, you know, different interesting places that animals have their organs. So like some insects have their ears on their legs.
Oh, that's like, weird. I didn't know that.
You know, and he talks about some of that stuff. And he talks about how some insects that are so small, like there's like spiders that are literally the size of your fingernail, that can see the craters on the moon. And you would think like, just because you think like, okay, I can maybe see the crater on the moon if I have a telescope or whatever. But, you know, or if it's a particularly bright moon, but these spiders can see that because that's how powerful the magnification is on their vision.
That's freaky. We must look so big to them.
A lot of the point of his book is that we should try to understand other creatures and adapt, like you said in the Darkness Manifesto, to incorporate other creatures' senses as well, because it's not just light that affects other creatures. You know, it's sounds, it's different things that we've done with our environment, you know, things like atmospheric pressure, things like that, like all like global warming, like all this stuff is having these huge impacts, and a lot of the stuff was, you know, created by humans. And yeah, so he talks about like songbirds that can see the Earth's magnetic field, which is like, ooh, cool.
That is really cool.
Yeah. He talks about jellyfish that have no brains, but that have very complex eyes. Yeah, he also talks about how, you know, like I said, he mentions dogs and the scented life of dogs, and how that's how they see the world. And so like when you're walking your dog, instead of like pulling them away from things, you should let them smell things, because they're getting so much information. They're getting like, who was here? What time were they here? You know, what did they eat? And I mean, they've done like studies, like, and that's the thing, is he talks to all these different scientists who've done all these studies, you know, scientists who study insects, scientists who study mammals, scientists who study humans and neuroscience. And I mean, they've found that some kinds of dogs can sniff out cancer, you know, sometimes they can sniff out all sorts of things. And it's like, and they're trained to do these things, but that's how powerful their sense of smell is. Like, I can't imagine ever smelling like that. I can barely smell like, you know, like the food in front of my face or whatever.
And people walk by like, do you smell that? No, I really don't. Yeah. I can't smell anything, I feel like.
Yeah, exactly. But my dog apparently can smell all of these things. Wow. And so it's, as a result of that, I was actually talking to our clerk, Thomas, and he was saying that he's been doing the same thing. When I walk my dog now, I've been taking her on special, like, dog walks. Like, yes. I always take her on dog walks in the morning before I go to work, but I'm usually, like, in a rush, and, like, I'm like, I gotta go to work, so we can't stop and smell everything, and she wants to stop and smell everything. And, you know, and the thing is, too, to keep their brain activity going and help them, you're supposed to take them to new areas to smell new things. And so, yeah, so I've been taking her on these walks where I've been taking her a little bit outside of our neighborhood and letting her, like, just, if she wants to smell something, I just stop and wait patiently. They're Harlow walks. That's my dog's name. Like, I'm like, this is Harlow time. She can do what she wants, you know. We'll sniff all the things, and I'll wait patiently instead of being like, I gotta be somewhere. Come on, let's go.
That's so cute. My parents have a basset hound, and they do something very similar. They call it, her name's Poppy, and they call it her Sniffafari, where she gets to just like go and like sniff around the yard and sniff. It's really cute. And I was like, oh, I just like see my dad out there like with the dog, and she's just sniffing away.
Yeah. But yeah, he touches on a lot of the stuff that you touched on too with the other book about the insects like moths being affected by light, about, you know, different species having problems hunting or doing things like, you know, owls hunt at night, but with all the light, sometimes it makes it hard for them to see because their eyes aren't adjusted to the brightness. Their eyes are adjusted more to the darkness. And so, you know, he talks about all that different stuff. But yeah, it's interesting because he goes into so many different creatures, like creatures in the oceans, creatures, like he talks about how, like, one of the things that was fascinating to me is apparently crocodiles, you know, their skin feels really rough and stuff, but apparently it's super, super sensitive.
Oh, weird.
Yeah. And so they can feel all sorts of things happening on their bodies that we, you know, that I might not be able to feel. Yeah. So I highly recommend it. Again, I did that one as an audiobook. And I know we have several copies here in our Lucky Day collection because he wrote an article for the New Yorker before it came out, and so it had like a lot of hype before it came out, and it was just kind of like an excerpt from the book that he put in there. And yeah. Oh, one other thing that before I move on to something else, he also talks about how blind humans use echolocation, and it's really interesting because he talks about how in previous times and up until more recently, a lot of educators were not against blind people teaching blind people and hearing impaired people teaching hearing impaired people. They wanted like able-bodied people to teach them, and then it's like, but you don't understand the world from their point of view. So like, and so it talks about this guy who, since he was young, he would use his cane, and he learned to use basically echolocation by tapping his cane on different things. Sure. He learned what an object might be. So like, you know, you tap it here, this has a certain sound, it's a door. You tap it over here, it has a certain sound, it's, you know, this. And so it talked about, you know, how certain environments can help with that, and then also how teaching blind people those sorts of skills is really important, and how taking other people's umwelts, their bubble, their sensory bubble into account, you know, can help us help them. And, you know, we need to not think of things as just being in our human bubble of like neurotypical, like everybody smells, sees, touches, hears, you know, it's like, no, they don't. And like, you know, think about things outside of that as well as, you know, not just for humans, but for non-human animals too. And so, yeah, it's super cool. Yeah. Do you have any others? Otherwise, I'll give you my last one.
I have one more that I'll briefly talk about. It's a really popular book right now. It's called How to Keep House While Drowning, A Gentle Approach to Cleaning and Organizing by Casey Davis. Okay. Some of you may recognize the author from TikTok, and it's all about cleaning and organizing. And she also works as a therapist. Mm-hmm. The whole book is basically focused on home care for those who are dealing with like mental health issues, physical illness, or just rough patches in your life, right? Where care tasks around your house really seem to fall by the wayside. Mm-hmm. And I really liked this book. I thought it was really fascinating because she talks a lot about how we can reframe our approach to home care and self-care to like get away from that guilt mindset. And that's kind of what traps us in this environment. Like we're too busy focusing on feeling guilty about the way our space looks that we're not even focusing on whether or not our space works for us. Some of it's like I'm reading, it's like, yes, this feels obvious, but I'm like, also, I'm not doing these things, right? It's like, yes, I know I shouldn't feel bad about this, but I do. And so it was really cool for me to watch the way she could kind of break that down and be like, here's how you can kind of unlearn that guilt. Here's how you can help set priorities for your house. She talks about like, she uses the phrase morally neutral a lot to kind of reframe our perceptions of our space, our bodies, and care tasks in general. And that was really kind of cool for me to think about and like kind of take a step back and like look at how I was framing these things. And it's like, why am I doing these tasks? Is it for me or is it for this kind of perceived ideal that this is what a house is supposed to look like? Am I doing it because of like some learned guilt about like the way spaces should be looking instead of thinking about, is this space even working for me? Is it functional? So she talks a lot about kind of setting up some strategies of how to approach care tasks when you are feeling overwhelmed. And it's like, you know, I get very guilty of that too. And apparently so do a lot of other people because this book is so popular. It's like, we're not alone, y'all. Where it's like, I just look around and I'm like, this whole house is a mess. I can't do anything. And you just get paralyzed because there's too much to do and you can't even like think about where to start. So she like kind of goes through some steps. Like, here's how you can approach this. Some of it she talks about are like setting functional priorities. It's like, what is important to you for your space to work and be functional for you? Don't even think about what it looks like. Is it working? Can you find what you need? Are you comfortable? Kind of thing. She also talks a lot about going one space at a time. And that's, oh man, I am so guilty of not doing that. It's like I do half of a task in one room, leave it half done, and then I do 3 dishes, leave the sink full of water, and then I put a load of laundry in, and it looks like the house is worse than when I started. So she has this, I can't remember all the steps exactly, but it's like a 5-step process that she offers. She's like, here's how you can approach it. You're like going to bag up all your garbage. You're going to put it by the door. You're not going to take it out because that's going to distract you. And then you're going to get off course and focusing on like one space at a time, not even one room, one space at a time. And she talks a lot about developing rhythms over routines because routines can feel really kind of punitive and they can really kind of, you feel guilty when you fall away from your routine, where she talks about kind of listening to yourself, what you need, and getting into a rhythm of what's going to work for you. But it was, I don't know, there's a lot in this little book. Like it's very small, it's a quick read, but there's so much in here. And there's a big focus in her book on how care tasks often get divided along gendered lines in a household and how that weighs more on some than others and what that means and how we're attaching a lot of value to these care tasks. It's a short little book with not a lot of words in it, but it's really, it's a lot to digest. Yeah. So I highly recommend it if it's something that you're also kind of struggling with. It's really validating in a lot of ways. No, it's like, wow, it's not just me. Yeah. This is a lot of people.
Yeah, it's wild to me because, like, you know, it's 2023 and I feel like we still have this standard of like, you have to look like your house has to look like it's an Architectural Digest magazine, you know?
It's in House Beautiful.
Yes, exactly. And, you know, you see these people on like social media that are kind of keeping that fallacy alive. But it's like, how many of us can actually do that? And like, even back in the 50s when like, it was like, that was like the thing that you're supposed to do. Even then, like people didn't have like perfect houses, but you know, but we have this idea that like, no, like house can't look like it's lived in. It's like,
it's so like we can't tell that someone has ever cooked here. No one has slept in this bed. No one wears clothes in this house. There's no laundry. Like
yeah. Nobody has any hobbies.
There are no pets.
There are no pets. Yeah.
No children. No toys.
Nothing. Yep.
No personality. Just blank cardboard people.
Yes. Yeah. So that actually kind of fits in a little bit with my last book. So the last book that I read was a book from 2019. It's called A Radical Guide for Women with ADHD. Embrace Neurodiversity, Live Boldly, and Break Through Barriers by Sari Solden and Michelle Frank. Solden and Frank are both psychologists. Sari Solden has been working with ADHD folks for over 30 years and is considered like an expert in the field. And Michelle Frank is somebody who actually graduated from Marquette University here in Milwaukee and then also went on to the Chicago School of Professional Psychology. One of the reasons that I picked it up is because in social media, like Instagram, TikTok, the talk about women with ADHD has kind of been a thing. And I started thinking like, well, maybe I have ADHD. And like, you know, some people are of the mindset that like, oh, everybody thinks they have these things and it's not true. But the thing is, one thing that we're learning over the last decade or so is that women are diagnosed differently than men.
Mm-hmm.
And so typically, you know, traditionally, things like autism and ADHD, neurodivergence, have been seen as typically male. But we're finding now that there's more autistic women than we thought, and there are more women with ADHD than we thought, because these things present themselves differently in them. And so they talk about that a little bit, you know, about how women with ADHD might have learned to pretend or mask, as they call it, that everything's okay, but inside they might be feeling like they're going to implode at all times because they're trying to juggle all these things and they don't understand how everybody else can do the things, you know, like make appointments, clean your house, do this, do that. Talks about, you know, different symptoms like people who talk very rapidly, all this sort of stuff. And I was like, oh, that sounds familiar.
You're like, wait, I see myself in this book.
So yeah, they basically put together like a lot of psychology books, a lot of different profiles on different women that are composites. You know, they're not a specific woman's story. They make up a name and put a bunch of different people's stories together and are like, this is so and so. This is what she experienced in her life. You know, she was really, really good at school, but she was terrible at like social relationships because she, you know, just couldn't like get social cues and didn't understand how social dynamics work and just didn't also ever have the ability to keep texting people because sometimes you forget and you're just like, you're like, oh, I really like this person, but like I also have 20 things to do and I get completely distracted and la 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 la, and it's 3 months later and it's like, oh my God, this person is never going to talk to me again because I have not texted them or emailed them or whatever. And so she talks all about, you know, that like interpersonal relationships. She talks about too about a lot of unhelpful behavior and from other people, you know, people being like, well, why don't you just try getting a planner? Why don't you just try doing this? And, you know, talks about how many patients she's had over the years. Both of them talk about how many patients they've had over the years that, you know, have tried all the planners, have tried all the things. And all it does is make you feel worse about yourself because you're like, something's wrong with me. I'm broken. And so a big part of the book is stepping away from that framework and being like, nothing is wrong with me. I am not broken. And learning what your individual strengths are, learning how to step out of negative self-talk, learning how to step out of those expectations, you know, kind of like you were saying with the cleaning, like things are morally neutral, you know.
Yes,
it's
this
like,
doesn't make you a bad person
yes.
because you can't do this. You didn't fail.
Yes. Yeah. So she, you know, they talk about that. They have a bunch of different exercises that you can do at the end of each chapter. You know, at the beginning of the book, it kind of goes over how ADHD presents itself in women. And then they have you like write a bunch of stuff down and be like, how many of these sound familiar to you? And then that kind of helps you be like, oh, yes, no. You know, they still suggest you talk to an actual therapist to get a diagnosis and all that sort of stuff. But, you know, this is the first step in doing so. And they're trying to get more people to understand what it's like to be a woman with ADHD and how to honor their neurodiversity and communicate confidently and express boundaries, you know, because they talk about how a lot of neurodivergent women, whether they have ADHD or autistic, a lot of neurodivergent women are not always the best at doing boundaries because they feel like they have to make everybody else happy. And so they put all their needs like down deep inside until they experience burnout and then kind of implode.
Yeah. And no one wins. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So yes, that one's really good. Again, I listened to that one, but you can like pause it and write down the exercises and do those. But we also have the book format of that one if that's easier for you. I wasn't always the best about doing the exercises because I was listening to this audiobook while I was like doing dishes or things like that. And I would just like do like mental checklists and be like, or like, you know, keep listening to whatever they were talking about. But yeah, they talk about the three different types of ADHD. They talk about the combined type, which apparently is what a lot of women tend to have. And then they talk about the hyperactive type, which is a type that we typically think of, which is like, you know, little boys who are like bouncing off the walls and can't sit still. And the inattentive type. And inattentive is also something that, you know, I mean, all three types affect women. But they say women tend to particularly usually be on either the combined type or inattentive type. And that's why we kind of fly under the radar, because inattentive it's more like, you're daydreamy and distracted all the time and, but you might still be quiet in class and stuff. So you're not a problem. So, the things don't happen at school that would normally happen with the kid who's bouncing off the walls because they're just like, oh, she's fine. She's just really quiet.
Right. She's
and
a great student. This is a desirable trait.
Yeah. She's just a little daydreamy. So if you're curious whether you think you might have ADHD or whether you think you might know someone who has ADHD or you just want to learn more about ADHD and women, I would recommend this book. It's really fascinating and sad to me how many things that we don't know about women in terms of healthcare, whether it's our brain development or, diseases that affect us or things like that, because just how our society is structured. And
oh, yeah. No. Men have been the standard for measuring off of, and of course, different bodies are different, right?
Yes, yeah.
So it's hard to, measure up. Like, of course, there's differences going to be there, but they're not in the textbook.
Yeah. Yeah, and so there's more books coming out. Like I've actually put a couple books on hold that are also about women with ADHD and women with autism. And I'm glad that there's more literature coming out about it.
You listen to all of yours on audiobook, right?
I did listen to all of mine on audiobook. That's like the only way that I can do nonfiction.
So I want to put all of our listeners onto a little life hack that one of the clerks shared with me. Julia gave me this brilliant idea because we all know I struggle with nonfiction because I can't force myself to like sit and read and do that kind of thing. Like I'm an audiobook girl at heart. But something that she has done is to check out the audiobook and the physical book at the same time and kind of switch between. Like, you can sit down, maybe read a chapter from the physical book and then sync up your position in the audiobook and listen and to kind of break up the nonfiction that way. And my mind was just like blown.
Yeah.
I was like, oh my gosh, I could totally do that, especially now that we have like resources like Hoopla where things are available instantaneously. You can get even really popular books right away without a wait list.
Yeah.
So if you've got that physical book, and we've got it on Hoopla as an audiobook.
Yeah.
Might be worth a go if you're a nonfiction struggler like I am. I know I'm going to try it with my next one.
Yeah. Just in general, nonfiction or fiction, I struggle sometimes because it's like sometimes I feel like my body needs to be moving. And so it's like, all right, well, I'm going to do the audiobook right now because my body needs to be moving. But sometimes I'm like, okay, I can sit right now and but when I feel like my body needs to be moving, if I sit and I read something, I'll read the same paragraph like 5 times and it won't go in there because my brain's just like, you need to move your body.
No, that's real.
So, yeah. All right. As always, if you have any questions or comments for your host, you can email us at shortstacks@gmail.com. You can find us on Podbean, Spotify, or iTunes. Until next time, thanks for listening and be well. The Shore Stacks is produced by Lisa Quintero and Lizzie Jelly for the Shore Public Library. Music for the show is by Kevin MacLeod. The song is called Ice Flow and can be found on incompetech.com.